So at least you can just ask your questions freely. So Professor Ang Cheng Guan is unable to join us today, but what he has done is he has actually very kindly given me a script. And then from that script, actually, we had done some slides to actually look at this. So what I'm doing is, what I'm presenting here is the Vietnamese perspective to the Vietnam War. Okay, so the period 1946 to 1965 essentially covers the first Vietnam War up to the start of the second Vietnam War. Okay, so and there's never been an official date for the start of the Vietnam War, the second Vietnam War. Although for the American side, we see the landing of the first troops in Da Nang in March 1965 as the start of the American involvement in Vietnam. But of course, their involvement actually comes very much earlier compared to this. Okay. For the Vietnamese communists, the war against the Americans is a continuation of the colonial war, pre-1945, right up to 1945, and then against the French. And the only difference being that the French colonial master they defeated in Dien Bien Phu had been replaced by a more powerful adversary, the USA. The Vietnamese call this war the anti-resistance war against the French and the American. So quite a large mouthful. And so with that introduction, we will now leap straight into the Vietnamese communist relations with China. So the focus that he has is to look at the Vietnamese communist relations with China from 1946 to 1965. So when we look at Europe, and we try to understand the Vietnam War, that context is extremely important. Hence, those relations is actually key. So essentially, when you look at the Vietnamese-China relations, they look at 1946 to 1949 as one period. So Professor Ang Cheng Guan's book with Malcolm Moffat on the Cold War deals with this. The second period is 1949 to 1954, right? His chapter with Professor Evelyn Goh from RSIS also looks at this, okay? And they identified the article on the Chinese role in Dien Bien Phu and the Vietnamese communist perspective. And then his Cheng Guan's book, his dissertation, The Vietnam War from the Other Side, deals with the period from 55 to 65. Right? So you will note that Geneva is quite important because it transits the 54 and 55 period. So now let's look at the first period that we have, 46 to 49. Okay. So the Franco-Viet Minh, which was what the Vietnamese communists were calling this first Vietnam War, the Franco-Viet Minh military hostilities, essentially begins in November to December 1946 in the cities of Haiphong as well as Hanoi. So Viet Minh armed forces at that time were weak, relatively small when compared to the French. And the People's Army, when you think about the communist forces, the People's Army, in which they call the army, was only constituted in December 1944. So they've got about 1 or 2 years to form a formal army from this period. And as you know, during this time, there was an ongoing war, a civil war in China. Okay, between the Kuomintang as well as the Chinese communists. So this is quite an important period to understand. There was a small-scale cross-border cooperation between the Vietnamese and the Chinese communists since 1946. However, according to the US and British intelligence sources, an agreement on military cooperation between the Chinese communists and the Viet Minh was believed to have been reached in June 1948. Then he put there question mark, okay? Because where these sources are, we need to actually look a little bit deeper at it. So developments along the China and Indo-China border during July 1948 bear out the likelihood of closer cooperative arrangements amongst the communists, with the Viet Minh actually taking the lead. So the Viet Minh leadership's new perspective of the armed struggle is to change from a general counteroffensive against the French, with the Chinese communists increasing presence in southern China. So in other words, as the communist presence begins to increase in southern China, these are key factors in the continued development of the Sino as well as the Viet Minh military collaboration, especially along these border areas. So scholarship in the English language on Vietnam, which some of you ask, what are some of the sources during this phase, is relatively scant. So it's an area of actually deeper research compared to the historiography of the Vietnam War and Indo-China wars in the post-50 period. So this period of Vietnam's and the Vietnam War is actually under research, particularly after the US became involved. So a good book to refer to, and he talks about some of his other books. So this is the border that you see. A good book to refer to is the one that you see on the left by Laura Kalkin. Okay, so the book's goal is to actually examine the political and military relationship between the Chinese and Vietnamese communist regimes, especially in regard to the Franco-Vietnamese conflict. The cooperation and tensions which arose as the two regimes simultaneously pursued the not always complementary goals of security and revolution. Okay, as such, the book's orientation is somewhat very different from the more well-known books. So the Chinese books are the ones that you see in the middle, by Chiang Chai as well as Chen Qian. So they are based on Chinese archival and related sources, written explicitly from the Chinese perspective. Yang Huei will be quite familiar with this. And also, both books do not deal with the pre-1950 period in a substantial way as Kalkin's does. So Kalkin's book is actually a good book to actually use when it comes to sources. Okay, for the Vietnamese communist focus, you should actually read Pierre Asselin's work. So his work, The Hanoi's Road to Vietnam War, is actually quite important. But his arguments are very similar to William Duiker's work, okay, The Communist Road to Power in Vietnam. Okay, so going back to the narrative, between 1947 and 1949, the military situations in both Vietnam and China made Sino-Vietnamese communications very difficult. This is according to this man, Hoang Van Horn, who was North Vietnam's first ambassador to China. And his accounts are corroborated by the Chinese. The ties were therefore quite limited, and there's no evidence of any substantial Chinese technical assistance during this period, the 1947 to 1949 period. Note that the Communist Party's fight in China was reached in what was described as a decisive phase in the autumn of 1948. But a communist victory in China was not yet a foregone conclusion. Fighting was still going on. And that's why I think that help was, to a certain extent, still limited. So from the period 1949 to 1954, so this is the slide that I have. Give me a second. From the period 1949 to 1954, China becomes communist in October 1949. North Vietnam and the PRC now established diplomatic relations on 18 January 1950. So the PRC was the first country in the world to actually recognize North Vietnam. And it tells you of the closeness between both countries. The First Vietnam War culminated in the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which lasted from 13 March to 7 May 1954. We now know that the Chinese military assistance to the Viet Minh victory was a key factor in Vietnam's communist success. And you can see here actually the kind of aid that they gave in terms of training, advices, and the equipment that they used to actually ferry ammunition and ferry tools, ferry war material right up to the battlefront. So most important event in this period is the 1954 Geneva Conference from 26 April to 20th July 1954, of which a lot has been written, especially from the Chinese perspective. For the Vietnamese perspective, Pierre Asselin's is a good source. And we will talk more about the Geneva Conference because this is quite an important factor, and we will deal with this in a masterclass that we'll have in 2nd of July. We've got to know considerably, we got to know considerably more about Vietnamese relations with China during the 1954 Geneva Conference in the late 1970s, when both countries went to war in February 1979. So when you had this Sino-Vietnamese relations and the border tensions and the brief war that was fought in February 1979, many of the sources were released during this period. Okay. And also during the period of Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in December 1978, more material was released. So the Vietnamese accused the Chinese in the Geneva Conference of betrayal, and the Chinese call out the Vietnamese for being ingrate, for not being kind of gracious enough and not thankful enough for the help that was given. So the Vietnamese victory at Dien Bien Phu took place less than 24 hours before the scheduled opening of the Geneva Conference. So in other words, they had a leverage and supposedly should have given the communist side considerable negotiating advantage, which did not materialize. So in other words, the Vietnamese communists charged and they accused the Chinese delegation and maybe even the Soviet delegation of compromising the victories that they had won. And Laura Kalkin's work shows this. Okay. Beijing's made up for this by assisting the economic reconstruction of North Vietnam. So from 1955 onwards, Chinese aid becomes quite important in the economic reconstruction of North Vietnam. In the period 1955 to 1965, let me see if my slides show there. So this is the Geneva Conference. So this period from 1955 to 1965, the period, a decade that culminates in the American landing in Da Nang in March 1965, marks the beginning of direct US military intervention in Vietnam. Although this is disputed, because from Kennedy's years and from Eisenhower's years, you would notice that the Americans were already involved. Okay, and it frames the key decision-making events on the Vietnamese side. And some of the events are these events. So if you're looking for sources, the 15th plenary session of the Vietnamese Communist Party in January 1959 is quite important. And this were only made public in May 1959. Okay, so this is where decisions are made. The second event is the Third Party Congress, September 1960, followed by the 9th plenary session of the Vietnamese Communist Party in 1963. And all these changes all takes place amidst Ngo Dinh Diem being in power, Ngo Dinh Diem's unexpected death in November 1963. And from 1963 onwards, the gradual escalation of the military struggle with the Americans getting more and more involved. So time doesn't allow us to go into the twists and turns of the events from 55 to 65. But any decision to intensify the armed struggle in the South must, from 1955 onwards, always take into consideration, from the North Vietnamese perspective, it must always take into consideration the views of Beijing as well as Moscow, because they are Vietnam's principal supporters. While Beijing is generally more sympathetic to the Vietnamese communist cause than Moscow, the Chinese were very wary of any intensification of the military struggle. Okay, when the North Vietnamese eventually made public the decision to renew armed struggle to unify the country on 13 May 1959, the Chinese apparently considered it as a reasonable idea and agreed to provide military aid. But for some reason that remains unclear, Beijing actually fails to deliver the promised military aid at the end of 1959. Beijing apparently went back on their promise for fear of worsening the military struggle. And this affected the relations briefly. But by May 1960, this relationship is once again improved and is portrayed as the relations between North Vietnam and China is portrayed as close as the teeth and the lips. So these developments should be seen against the backdrop for the purpose of this session when we try to study the Sino-Soviet tensions. So despite their reliance on China and the Soviet Union to prosecute the war against the Americans, the Vietnamese communists were remarkably in control of their own decision-making in both the conduct of the war as well as the appropriate timing to negotiate with the USA, despite the wishes of their Chinese and Soviet patrons. Okay. Finally, there's a Laos dimension, but the person to best speak about the Laos dimension is actually Bruce Lockhart, because he's the expert in this area and he's familiar with those sources. So with that, I'm going to pass the time over to Yang Huei, who will speak about the Chinese perspective to this.
Thank you, Lloyd. Let me just share the thing, right?
So in the meantime, we will take questions from the chat bar. So you just put it in the chat bar and we'll answer them as best as we can.
Yeah. So so I'm going to set a timer, right? And then
don't need, it's okay. Just go with the flow.
Yeah. So right, thank you, Lloyd, for the succinct presentation on the Vietnamese perspective for both Vietnam and conflicts. Now, from my presentation, my focus is necessarily from the Chinese side. My time frame, like what Lloyd had mentioned, the scope of my lecture is as follows. All right, let me just push the thing. Right, I would like to kick off my lecture by a juxtaposition of the Chinese view of Ho Chi Minh and Ho's alleged perception of the Chinese. The point I would like to underline is the historical ambiguity which Vietnam had long viewed China. From Zhou's address, you can see from the slide, we can readily see the long history Chairman Ho had with the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party was formed in China. Ho himself was in exile in China, Russia, and even spent a spell in Hong Kong prison. Even though Ho seized power in the aftermath of the Japanese surrender at the end of World War II, he had to contend with the KMT troops under Opium General Lu Han in northern Vietnam. So the context of Ho's commands was his justifications for the controversial 1946 Accords he signed with the French. He was explaining why it was important to be freed from the KMT's enormous presence in North Vietnam. Even so, his chagrin with the presence of the Chinese could be a leitmotif, very useful for us, right? For all the Vietnamese revolutionaries' ambiguous relationship with China up to the tragic war of 1979. Such ambiguity stemmed from the tremendously close relationship between DRV and PRC. As I mentioned by Lloyd just now, he was talking about the lips and teeth. It's Chinese idiom, 唇亡齿寒, right? So indeed, the 1st Regiment of the Southern Guangdong People's Force sheltered in Vietnam when the Chinese Civil War was raging, right? For the Chinese, Vietnam had always been a very handy strategic rear. So Ho immediately requested the nascent Viet Minh troops, right, to be trained by the Chinese regiment. This was timely as Ho's accord with the French broke down in December 1946. Now, unfortunately, the convenient quid pro quo ended when the 1st Regiment returned to China in August 1946, right? They returned to China in August 1949. Under tremendous pressure from French, Viet Minh literally reaped the nadir of these fortunes in 1949. Small wonder then that PRC founded in October 1949, Ho immediately requested, right, from his neighbor, official recognition, number 1, and then $10 million in aid. Ho's requested was propitious for Mao himself was negotiating with Stalin for a mutual defense treaty. All right. So in Mao's absence, Liu Shaoqi, which is step number 2, was already laying the groundwork for official recognition of DRV when Ho arrived in Beijing on 30th Jan 1950, but on foot. All right. Receiving Ho personally, Liu set out to name Luo Guibo as the CCP Politburo liaison to the DRV. Mao, on the other hand, obtained Stalin's second endorsement to be the champion of Asia's revolutionary movement. In other words, Mao had to uphold the promise of proletariat internationalism, all right, in this part of the world. So Ho was hurriedly flown to Moscow to join Mao. When Ho actually broached the issue of the similar treaty with Stalin on 3rd Feb, Stalin waved him off, all right? During the train trip back, Mao will make it up to Ho by promising aid. But at this point, Mao would cautiously not commit the entry of Chinese soldiers. Why? Mao's caution was understandable, for the Chinese Politburo would be at this point in time hotly debating their very entry into the Korean conflict by 7 July. There was another war from which Stalin had pushed off to Mao, right? So the Korean War has started on 25th June, and Zhu De, right, actually insisted that as internationalists, we should regard assistance to Vietnam as an important international task and should spare no effort to help the Vietnamese, all right, and to achieve victory. So in fact, by March 1950, the Chinese Advisory Group, CMAC, was formed. And on 14 April, Wei Guoqing was named as the Army Group Commander. Cheng Guan was deputized to be the Century Community's representative to CMAC. And one notable characteristic of this early Chinese involvement was that CMAC reported directly to the CCP Military Commission. Even Mao was heavily involved, often, quote unquote, directly reviewed battle plans and gave specific directions, right? So you would think that this close collaboration means the working relationship must be very smooth. The truth cannot be further than that, all right? As early as May 1950, Liu Shaoqi had actually cautioned Luo Guibo that, quote unquote, our Vietnamese comrades have some particularities. For example, they shy away from stating their deficiencies, disregard the importance of Chinese experience, and are very dependent on external aid and liberally demand help. So obviously, it's not very flattering. So General Ngiap, aka the Red Napoleon, was no shrinking violet. He clashed openly with Cheng Guan, all right? And Cheng Guan repeatedly referred the matter to his superiors in Beijing. And even Ho was dragged in to persuade Ngiap to relent. Though the campaign was successful, Cheng Guan was sent to the Korean front, all right, because too much trouble. In his published diary, Ngiap was described by Cheng Guan as slippery and not very upright and honest, right? From Mao's strategic perspective, it made imminent sense to consolidate the northeast and expand the northwest border areas. Yet Viet Minh High Command saw otherwise. They prefer to directly move to the Central Plains. Main reason, they are very impatient, all right? So when Cheng Guan gone, Ngiap had his way, but the 4 Central Plains campaign was at best inconclusive. This time, Wei Guoqing's frustration spilled over, and he requested Mao for direct intervention as early as 27 May 1951. Surprisingly, Mao shielded Wei Guoqing gently, even as he supported his subordinate's professional interpretation. Despite the apparent failure of the Central Plains campaign, the Chinese were actually allowing the Viet Minh to fail productively. All right. So Mao reminded Wei Guoqing that the Chinese Red Army had their fair share of mistakes 2 decades ago. So now the question is, did Mao recognize the difficulties and particularities of the interstate alliance at this early stage? Or did he recognize the utility of Viet Minh earning their spurs in the minor battles? Whatever the case may be, the embedded Viet Minh soon returned to the northwest border areas in 1951 as advised by Mao and consolidated their strength just as what the chairman had recommended earlier. Right. Sorry. Okay, so the lessons of the Central Plains campaign provided rise to the mill for Wei Guoqing extensive plans for Viet Minh's transformation, training for commanders, military doctrines were written for the Vietnamese veteran, entire regiment were trained and equipped by PLA. Operational maneuvers up to division level were conducted under the supervision of the Chinese to create greater strategic depth for the Viet Minh. The CCP Central Committee made the fateful recommendation for Viet Minh to expand into Laos and Cambodia. So Bruce Lockhart will come in from there. So task rated, the Viet Minh launched their northwest offensive, and then the French frantically tried to shore up the position and conducted counter-offensive in Operation Lorraine to no avail. Throughout North Vietnam, Viet Minh steadily pushed out the French forces. By the summer of 1953, it was the French turn to reach the end of the ropes. To disrupt Viet Minh gains, the French channeled 15,000 troops into the northwest area named Dien Bien Phu. The latter's strategic importance belied its remoteness. If the French were able to stay put, it would have threatened Viet Minh's northern bases so painstakingly established and its recent linkages with Laos. Mao ordered Viet Minh to retake Dien Bien Phu at all costs. For once, Ngiap agreed with the Chinese strategic assessment. All right. So if, as you can see from a slide on the right-hand side, that is the Chinese logistical support. I will not read it out. You can read it for yourself. So here, this is the amount of the aid that the Chinese pumped in, all right? On top of all the war material, which was poured into the hell in a very small place, as immortalized by Bernard Faw's celebrated book, the Chinese equipped another rocket battalion and recoilless gun battalion and sent it into battle. All in all, 40,000 Viet Minh troops would annihilate the French forces in Dien Bien Phu. Through the spirit of proletariat internationalism, the total aid which the Chinese gave the DRV will be a hefty 43.2 billion, all right? Now, we come to the Geneva Conference. So here, a quote from Clausewitz would be very useful, whereby he said that war is nothing but a continuation of policy with other means. Why is this useful? Because we can see that at this point in time, the Chinese decided enough is enough. We have the Vietnamese had won the battle, right? It's time to pull back. What are some reasons for them to pull back? By 1954, the Chinese had finished a ruinous war in Korea, whereby according to US estimates, 920,000 were killed or wounded. Their own domestic development was paramount, notwithstanding the fact another 43.2 billion were given to the Vietnamese, as illustrated earlier. For the embedded Chinese, it was time for peace in Geneva. Hence, Ho was subject to arm twisting on 3rd July in Liuzhou in Guangxi. All right. So the Soviets for themselves were even more anxious for peace, all right, in the post-Stalin international development. Superficially, the French, aka the Mendes formula, looked reasonable. a temporary partition followed by a plebiscite in July 1956. There was a promise of unification, albeit at a later date. So both the communist powers strong-armed DRV to accept the deal. Yet it was all wishful thinking. Why? Because the US was not a party to this agreement. We now know from the Pentagon Papers that the Eisenhower administration literally gave carte blanche to Diem government not to hold a plebiscite. So once no plebiscite, the whole thing will fail. And once it became clear that the Zhou's deal was dead in the water, Hanoi officially resumed armed resistance in the South in 1959 to 1960. However, the Vietnamese armed resistance in the South played second fiddle to the series of momentous political upheavals in China. So this was actually referred to by Lloyd just now. So Beijing cut off domestic dissent with a massive political movement in July 1957, what they call the anti-rightist campaign. Out of this massive persecution campaign, some 500,000 were proscribed and victimized. And then immediately after that came the Great Leap Forward in 1958. In other words, China was absorbed in its own transformation. Reports of malfeasance, starvation came in as early as autumn 1958. Vietnam was placed on the back burner for obvious reasons. This state of affairs explained the lethargic responses of Beijing to Hanoi, right? As you can see from the slide, Beijing will tell them, why don't you just focus on promoting socialist revolution? And Zhou actually told Ho Chi Minh that you must be flexible, not be so keep on begging for aid. But the truth of the matter is lethargy is not the same as neglect. For from 1956 to 1963, war material continued to flow south at a tune of 320 million, right? So now here comes the interesting question, that is, how was the DRV going to unplug the spigot of Chinese aid? At this juncture, it's important to give credit to Ho's creativity in capturing the Chinese interest once again with Vietnam. The Vietnamese had closely followed the twists and turns of Mao's tension diplomacy or limited belligerency in 1958 Taiwan Straits crisis. They understood that for Mao, international crisis served to mobilize the population for the Great Leap Forward. Indeed, Mao demonstrated alarm with Ho's prognosis in the summer of 1962 and the possibility of US escalation, which included an invasion, right, of North Vietnam. At the end of the year, Mao told Ngiap that China would study the possibility of a US invasion. At the meantime, China would promise to equip up to 19 North Vietnamese divisions, all right? So in reality, Ho's specter of a US invasion inadvertently played into Mao's hands. The domestic political concerns of China reared its ugly head again. The massive economic failure in the aftermath of Great Leap took China 3 to 4 years to resolve. Mao's image of the great helmsman took a beating, and he retreated the second line in 10 December 1958. Obviously very annoyed to be treated like a dead man in his own funeral, quote unquote, Mao chafed at the restraints of collective leadership, or what you call inner party democracy. So staging a comeback, all right, by 1962, Mao claimed the class struggle must continue, and that Sino-India conflict in October allowed Mao to marshal his political resources to make a comeback. So another round of political mobilization in 1963, the so-called socialist education movement upheld the importance of the class struggle. Now, fueling this rapid radicalization within China itself was the very public split with Soviet Union in 1961. So earlier, Khrushchev had ended Soviet Union cooperation in 1959, and Soviet experts were sent home at the height of the Great Leap disaster. Now, the Soviet Union, all right, was denounced as part of the urban industrialized countries clique. When China placed itself as a leader of the rural undeveloped countries front, it was a natural extension of the 1950s proletariat internationalism. It was at this juncture Ho's spectre achieved its desired impact. In other words, Ho's request for aid resonated well with the Chinese audience, as China had to be more revolutionary than Soviet Union. So Zhou would announce China's determination to lend its hand to all revolutionary third world countries. So at this point in time, the Gulf of Tonkin incident is interesting, all right, because it seemingly transformed Ho's warning into a hard reality. In response, the PLA at Kunming and Guangzhou entered into code red. Subsequently, the Chinese held public rallies to denounce the Americans' so-called hostilities. But privately, Mao shrewdly questioned Li Xuan on 13 August 1964. Presenting contradictory reports from Chinese intelligence, Mao flatly put Li Xuan down a peg or two by stating that the 4th August attack was an accident, right? It is not an American invasion. This was not a precursor, all right? Clearly, rhetorically bludgeoning domestic forces and the Soviet Union with the Vietnamese were one thing. It was quite another to put oneself in harm's way. Mao would carefully determine China's appropriate responses to armed resistance. So-called the tail would not wag the dog, right? So when Johnson expanded the war with Operation Rolling Thunder, the aerial bombardment of North Vietnam, the Chinese artfully qualified their involvement by stipulating that no ground war to be extended to North Vietnam and the US planes should not bomb China, all right? So you can read from the slide, the red font that is the stage of Chinese warnings, right? So essentially the art of signaling clearly went all the way back to the Taiwan Straits crisis in the 1950s. The Chinese carefully noted the limited nature of US area sorties, especially Johnson's posture of quiet reasonableness, and emphatically returned the favor by circumscribed involvement, not only restricted to logistical aid to DRV. So the two adversaries literally correctly read each other, all right? So important was the Chinese role in this that Li Xuan unreservedly thanked Liu Shaoqi in April 1965 as DRV's most reliable friend. All in all, the Chinese support achieved its aims. Alan Whiting and John Garvin correctly identified that Chinese support of DRV gave the Johnson administration pause. That's why they did not expand drastically, all right? So at its peak, Chinese sent 170,000 engineering troops to aid DRV with only logistical demands, freeing the NVA to focus on operations. Secondly, decision and war plans were wholly in Hanoi's hands. Finally, unless there was a land invasion of DRV, no Chinese soldier will be utilized. In the final analysis of the characteristic of this phase of Chinese aid to DRV, one can surmise, number one, the experiences of the Korean War, all right, was sobering, all right. Number two, that cooperation with North Vietnamese in the 1950s had taught the Chinese that the Vietnamese were very picky and very nationalistic, so it's better to keep at arm's length. Number three, it serves propaganda purpose to proclaim, use every opportunity to serve the Vietnamese people. Reality actually demands circumspection, all right? So now I'll be coming to the final slide. I think I'll slightly overrun by 1 or 2 minutes, so hope that's all right. So the year of 1965 stood out for its beginnings of the long downturn in DRV relations, ironically, all right? For example, Soviet Union Premier Alexei Kosygin actually pushed onto Hanoi, promising Soviet Union aid on 11 Feb 1965. According to academic Nicholas Koo, the Soviet Union gambit was not to force Hanoi to choose either or. Subtlety dictated a nuanced approach, whereby Soviet Union would quietly give aid and increase the contacts at Hanoi, all right? This wedge policy, or what you call the silent wedge policy, proved to be enormously successful. Hanoi began to show independence from Beijing, and all criticism of Soviet Union revisionism were correspondingly muted, right? And the Chinese were actually very unhappy, all right? They tried to warn the Vietnamese of so-called conspiracies around Soviet Union, but to no avail, all right? So final slide. So despite all these open concerns, all this would fall on deaf ears. Incredibly, in 1966, DRV media broadcast a program which reiterated ancient invasions of Vietnam by China. To rub salt in the wound, Li Xuan, in his March 1966 speech to the Soviet Union Communist Party, actually described Soviet Union as a second motherland. So according to Chen Jian, all right, the Chinese were thoroughly disheartened and dismayed, and on 13 April, then tersely offered to withdraw all Chinese troops to placate the Vietnamese, to which, of course, Li Xuan hotly protested. To demonstrate his displeasure, the Chinese withdrew, all right, the 2nd Division Engineering Division in July 1966, all right? So to conclude, I'd like to draw your attention once again to Ho's 1946 warnings about the so-called Chinese proclivity to park themselves in Vietnam. It is clear from this presentation state-to-state relations are very hard work, and the deal was made more difficult by deep historical ambiguities. All right. Despite the veneer of communist ideology, right, it only served to paper over deep ethnocentric and nationalistic differences. Initially, Mao was motivated deeply by proletariat and internationalism. Having been anointed by Stalin, all right, Mao could do no less. Within a span of less than a decade, the Chinese were involved directly and indirectly in Korea and Vietnam. Having secured peace, the Chinese desire for economic development proceeded to curtail in a significant way the Chinese belligerency and pointed towards Mao's preference for tension diplomacy, only enough to stir up trouble for their convenience, but never enough to endanger itself. This underscores another key to understand the intricacy of Chinese foreign policy, that is, Chinese domestic imperatives. Using external crisis for radicalization of Chinese politics and to gain domestic political supremacy had become a modus operandi for Mao by the time of the Second Taiwan Straits crisis. All right. Finally, a page for the Peloponnesian War, the so-called Melian Dialogue in 416 BC, should serve to illustrate the precarious position of the DRV. The strong do what they do, and the weak suffer. Ultimately, Hanoi was important to China if it serves China's interests. Once Mao's Committee of Elders had brandished policy recommendation for Beijing to seek US to deter the Soviets, starting from February 1969, therein heralded the final turning point in Soviet Sino-DRV's relations. China wasted no time to improve Sino-US relations at the expense of the DRV. Beijing will literally lay out the carpet for Nixon and Kissinger, but that will be a lecture for another day. Okay.
Thank you, Pang.
Yeah, let me stop sharing. Sorry for going over time.
So while we allow Marek to get ready his slides, maybe take a small short break and think about how you would actually periodize this period. And also, what are some questions that you have about the content? So we'll deal later first with the content and then the pedagogy later on, how to teach secondary school students. So I'm just going to pass the time over to Marek, and Marek will present the Soviet perspective to this. Marek, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Lloyd. And thanks for the invitation. It's great to be back in Singapore, albeit virtually only for now. Yes, so I'm going to talk about the Soviet Union and the wars in Vietnam. So how did it all look from the perspective of Moscow? And I think many of you will see that there's a lot of similarities and a lot of overlaps between what Dr. Pang just mentioned and what I will be presenting, because the two big supporters, the two allies of the Vietnamese communists actually, of course, interacted in many ways, and it will be very interesting to see those parallels. So let us get started. But to do that, I'm planning to go back in time a little bit more than 1945. Actually, I think it's important to have a good context to take a look at what happened before 1945 in the context of Vietnam and the Soviet Union. And that is related to the person of Ho Chi Minh, right? Of course, we are all familiar with Ho Chi Minh, the key nationalist and communist from Vietnam. And it's important to know that he started his anti-colonial sort of struggle initially looking for support from the West, who was inspired by American President Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I. But later, Ho found inspiration in communism. And he believed that communist ideology with its very strong anti-colonial pronouncements could be a way, could be a means to wage anti-colonial struggle in Vietnam. So Ho himself spent a bit of time in Moscow between 1923 and 1924. So in the interwar period, that's where he attended the Comintern Congress 1924, and later he was sent by Comintern, by the Communist International, on an assignment to Guangzhou, where he set up the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League. So at that point in time, Ho Chi Minh, this Vietnamese revolutionary, is actually a Comintern agent working on the payroll of Moscow to further this revolutionary activity of the communist movement in Asia. And on the right-hand side, we have the picture of Yang Huei with fellow communist revolutionaries in Moscow in the 1920s. Now, but there was a problem, right? Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, and first and foremost, he wanted to struggle for Vietnamese independence. So that presented some problem to his relationship with Moscow. Firstly, Ho set up a Vietnamese Communist Party. Rather, he united a disparate group into a Vietnamese Communist Party around the year of 1930. But then, by the direction of Moscow, he was forced to rebrand this as Indo-Chinese Communist Party, basically removing that Vietnamese element, because Moscow at the time believed that the revolution has to take place in the colonial countries, and the struggle within the colonized world, like Indochina, should really be connected to the struggle with the colonial countries, in this case, France. So no point setting up a separate Vietnamese Communist Party. It should be an Indo-Chinese struggle with that goal of, communist revolution. So Ho didn't really like that, because he was first and foremost communist revolutionary. Now, in the 1930s, the situation changed because Ho Chi Minh himself was sidelined. Well, he was imprisoned for a while in China. Later, he ended up in Moscow. And at the same time, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party went under the influence of very strongly pro-Kremlin, pro-Moscow leadership of the ultra-leftist orientation, basically graduate of the Stalin School in Moscow. So already at this stage of the formation of the Vietnamese communist movement, we can see that that relationship between revolutionaries like Ho Chi Minh and the communists in Moscow and the Soviet Union was rather complicated and a little bit rocky, which actually will translate later into their relationship around the period that we are talking about during the First Vietnam War. So let's take a look what happened later. So during World War II, of course, Vietnam and Indochina is under Japanese occupation. Vietnamese communists are initially heavily decimated by the French secret police, and at that point in time, Ho Chi Minh comes back to Vietnam in 1941, and he founds the League for the Independence of Vietnam, known as Viet Minh. So it is important because at that point in time, Ho Chi Minh is able to bring together desperate independence fighters, not only communists, although Viet Minh was led by communists, and oriented against the Japanese, but also against the French. Now, importantly, there was no connection or no support from the Soviet Union. That contacts were cut because of World War II going on, right? But Ho was able to collaborate with the American OSS teams at the same time. Why it is important? Because the Soviets would get to know about that later, and that again strains the relationship. Now, Viet Minh seized Hanoi after Japanese capitulation in 1945, and Ho Chi Minh proclaimed independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in September 1945. So that's the immediate history leading us to the First Vietnam War. Here we have a picture of Ho Chi Minh and Giap, or Nhiap, his key lieutenant at that time. It's important to note that Ho, Giap, as well as Pham Van Dong, his close collaborators, were not dogmatic communists. Rather, they had very strong nationalist tendencies. Okay, so let us see how this translates into the period of the First Vietnam War, or the First Indochina War, as it is usually known, for the period of 1946-1954. So, as I think it's widely known, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union in the immediately post-World War II period, was decidedly focused on Europe, right? It was important for Stalin to set up the so-called quote-unquote buffer zone in Eastern Europe. He was worried about safety of the borders of the Soviet Union, and that's really where he was focusing on. So Comintern, Communist International, which in the interwar period was very much engaged in revolutionary activities in Asia, where Ho Chi Minh worked for before, was actually disbanded in 1943 and did not have an official success, right? There were some Soviet activities in Southeast Asia run through the Soviet embassy in Bangkok, but they were quite limited. The Vietnamese communists of Ho Chi Minh's, under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, set up some limited contacts with the Soviet embassy in Bangkok, but they were mostly just probing intentions, and there was lack of trust. And that lack of trust, of course, had roots in Ho Chi Minh's actions during and before World War II. So until 1949, 1950, there is really no Soviet involvement in Indochina, in Vietnam to speak of. But the watershed event, as Dr. Pang earlier mentioned, is of course the communist victory in China. So the communist victory, setting up of the People's Republic of China in 1949, leads to Ho Chi Minh's visit to Moscow in 1950. Now, this visit is brokered by Mao, brokered by the Chinese, and it's really through Mao that Ho is introduced to Stalin. Okay, so let's see how that interaction worked out. So the immediate consequence, Soviet Union recognized Democratic Republic of Vietnam in January 1950. Important step, but it's also, I think, we are right to say that it wasn't that profound. Importantly, there was no ambassadorial appointment from Moscow in Hanoi until 1954, until after the Geneva Conference. So the Soviets were really quite cautious here. Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh himself reportedly hoped for a treaty of alliance that they would be able to set up with Soviet Union, but they were distrusted by Stalin. And Stalin was pretty happy to let China, to let Mao lead that support for the resistance against the French in Vietnam, but himself did not want to get directly involved. Now we can see that the Soviet approach was quite contradictory. So on the one hand, the Soviets would very vocally support national liberation and anti-colonial movements around the world, but at the same time, in case of Vietnam, there was almost no material help during the First Indochina War. Now there was certainly low priority that Stalin put on events in Vietnam. And further, things were complicated with the start of the Korean War. So Stalin was especially cautious after that, seeing the Western resolve during the Korean conflict. He would not really want to get Soviet Union more involved in struggle against a Western power, in this case, France. So that's the situation during the First Indochina War, a very clear-cut division of labor. The Soviets generally supported the struggle of the Vietnamese communists, but it was the Chinese who were directly rendering help. There is a possibility that some Soviet material and material support actually ended up in Vietnam indirectly through China, or perhaps some of the shipments that were directed to Korea were redirected to Vietnam. But there's really not too much to speak of at that point in time. Now, let us now talk about the Geneva Conference. That is really a very important moment here, and it comes just immediately after change of leadership in Moscow. So Stalin dies in 1953. He is then replaced by this collective leadership of initially three important figures, right? So we have Molotov, we have Malenkov, and we have Khrushchev. Over time, it's Khrushchev who emerges as the top dog, right? And he is the key player later on. So after Stalin's death, the Soviets pursued the peaceful coexistence with the West policy of détente, basically lessening tensions at the world stage. They were still more interested in Europe, but they were worried that possible international crisis could erupt in Indochina because of American involvement. During the First Indochina War, Americans were involved mainly by supporting the French war effort, financially, and also with the help of advisors and material support. So at the time of Geneva Conference, both the Chinese and the Soviets were determined to seek negotiated settlement at Geneva for their own particular reasons. And Dr. Pang mentioned what were the reasons of the Chinese point of view. The Soviets certainly wanted to lessen tensions at the world scale. They were worried about possible escalation. they also wanted to bring in China to this big power table at the same time. So Molotov served as a co-chairman of the Geneva Conference together with Anthony Eden from the UK. And Molotov himself worked to facilitate compromise and was actually instrumental in convincing the Vietnamese to make some of the concessions. It was mostly Zhou Enlai who was actually liaising with Pham Van Dong representing the Vietnamese. But Molotov himself was, for instance, quite instrumental in convincing the Vietnamese to agree to a partition of Vietnam, a temporary division along the 17th parallel as a compromise at the end of Geneva Conference. So certainly the Soviets and the Chinese had a mitigating effect on the Vietnamese, and of course later that was interpreted as a betrayal of sorts. I think it's important to note that in fact, before the Geneva Conference, there was already some sort of agreement that the partition of Vietnam will likely take place. But it's that victory at Dien Bien Phu that emboldened the Vietnamese, and they were not necessarily willing to give that military advantage. However, after sort of mitigating influence of their Soviet and Chinese patrons, they decided to compromise. Okay, so what happened after the Geneva Conference? So we have Khrushchev at this point, who emerges as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and Soviet Union engages in the relationship with Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with North Vietnam, to a significant degree. Certainly, there's much more connection and interaction than before, where they were very limited. So, for instance, we had economic and military cooperation that included, for example, 400 million rubles to restore the North Vietnamese economy, 60 million rubles of credit for equipment and materials for the army. So the Soviets got actively involved in supporting this consolidation of the North Vietnamese state after the years of war, right? However, it's still important that it was the Chinese who were taking the lead in the relationship with the Vietnamese. And at the end of 1950s, China still provided about 60% of aid to DRV, while the Soviet Union only 30%. The remainder 10% was split across other Eastern European states, the countries of the Soviet bloc, who were also pretty engaged after Geneva Conference in supporting the Vietnamese comrades, right? So Poland, especially Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany. So that's the situation on the sort of economic front and the front of reorganization of DRV, the North Vietnam. However, a big question we need to ask ourselves is, what about the unification? Now, one of the provisions of the Geneva Conference was, of course, a peaceful unification by elections that was supposed to take place in 1956. Now, it became quite obvious that the Soviets were not determined to support unification of Vietnam at all costs. In fact, to them, status quo was deemed satisfactory. Now, there's some evidence to prove that, and it's something that's also very interesting to me because of my own research interests. For example, the consultations between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, supposedly leading to elections in 1956, were supposed to start in mid of 1955. There was a particular proposal put forward by India, who was chairing International Control Commission, supervising the agreements at that time, to bring those parties together in April 1955. This proposal was transmitted to both sides, the communist and anti-communist side. Now, we know, based on the evidence, that the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, were actually keen to pursue that proposal. They discussed that in Beijing, and there was a tacit approval from the Chinese. But Moscow did not support that initiative. In fact, the Soviets told the British at that time that the Indian proposal can be put to rest, that they will not be pushing for its implementation. It's also important to know that the issue was not raised at the Geneva summit in 1955, the summit of Big Four a year after Geneva Conference that you can see on the picture on the right here. We have Bulganin on the left representing the Soviet Union. The issue of Vietnam was sort of pushed down the agenda, not really made a big headline at that time. Now, more so in 1957, after the deadline for unifying election passed, the Soviets actually proposed to admit both Vietnams to the United Nations. indicating their acceptance of a permanent division. Now, of course, this is something that the Vietnamese were not very pleased. They certainly appreciated the aid received, but they did not really like the approach on the diplomatic front, where the Soviets did not really push for that unification as the ultimate goal. So what happens next? Well, this Soviet disinterest actually led to estrangement of Moscow-Hanoi relations in early 1960s. And this coincides with the Sino-Soviet split that was ensuing at the time that Dr. Pang talked about. Now, this is the point in time where Le Duc, right, on the right-hand side picture with Mao here, emerges as the key leader of the Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh, of course, is still the figurehead, he's still the president, but his influence from 1960 really onwards is really not that significant. So it's Le Duc who is emerging as the leader, and he wants to pursue South first policy of armed struggle from around 1960 onwards. And that kind of, together with the Soviet ambiguous approach, leads to a stronger Hanoi sort of orientation pro-Beijing at that time, while the Soviets were not really able or willing to push for a stronger action in Vietnam. Later, we have Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and after that, the Soviets are certainly seeking to ease international tensions again. That means the Vietnamese look to Beijing for support for a more sort of military approach to their struggle. Now, the situation changes in 1964. We have a change in the Kremlin. So Leonid Brezhnev deposed Nikita Khrushchev and became the new leader of the Soviet Union. And that coincides with, firstly, the increased American involvement in Vietnam after the Tonkin Gulf incident that was mentioned earlier. But also, that kind of puts Moscow in a position that they need to make certain steps to improve their international standing. So they decide to get involved in Vietnam out of a need to preserve its image, the Soviet image within the socialist camp, and not to lose ground to the Chinese communists, right? So the Sino-Soviet split is in full swing. The Soviets want to show that, well, they can do more or better than the Chinese. They want to show credibility to other socialist or communist players in the world as supporting their struggle. So that leads, in the context of Vietnam, to a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, the Soviets pledged to provide necessary aid to North Vietnam. But on the other hand, still with that kind of reserved approach, they would also seek diplomatic solution as much as possible and will try to send out feelers to look for a diplomatic solution as much as possible. So this is the middle way that the Soviets were pursuing at that time. Now, the situation leads to a further engagement of the Soviet Union a year later, 1965, and this coincides with this vision of this visit of Alexei Kosygin, a prime minister and sort of Brezhnev's right-hand man at that time. He visits Vietnam, and just so happens that that coincides with the Flaming Dart bombing campaign that is initiated by the Americans, which gives that kind of psychological reason for increased Soviet support to the struggle of the Vietnamese. On the right-hand side, we see a picture of Kosygin with Ho Chi Minh. And now some argued that Kosygin actually wanted to pursue a rather sort of conciliatory approach, trying to encourage some negotiation and settlement of the conflict, but this sort of Flaming Dart campaign taking place at the same time during his visit in Hanoi made it just impossible, and the Soviets had to wholeheartedly support the Vietnamese struggle. Now the result is, so either way, the result was a steadily increasing inflow of weaponry from the Soviet Union. And it's important to know that by 1968, yes, we're going beyond the scope of the presentation, but we need to cover a few things here. By 1968, Moscow became the chief supplier of military and economic aid to Vietnam, surpassing the Chinese for the first time. And also importantly, military experts, quote unquote, were sent from the Soviet Union to Vietnam. They were mostly pilots, surface-to-air missile operators, technicians. They certainly did come into contact with some Americans at that point in time, but this I think has not yet been fully researched, and we don't really have exact numbers to put to that. Now, let me finish with a few points on what happened after 1965. So between 1965 and 1968, Hanoi certainly attempted to maintain balance in the relations between Moscow and Beijing. Of course, that's because the war was intensifying. They were certainly willing to keep support and supply from both sides. However, the decision to enter negotiations with the Americans in 1968 was made against Chinese wishes, and that kind of marked a more direct turn towards Moscow. Now, of course, the negotiations lasted 5 years and only bore fruits in 1973, but this showed that the Vietnamese were willing to disregard Chinese objections, actually follow Moscow's line. Now, it doesn't mean that the relationship was not rocky. Indeed, it was. The Vietnamese did not inform Moscow about their planned 1972 Easter offensive, for example. On the other hand, we had Nixon's visit to Moscow in the same year that kind of unsettled the relationship for a while. However, long term, it was certainly the Soviets that were getting the upper hand over Chinese in the relationship with the Vietnamese comrades. Ultimately, after the Vietnam War, the Second Vietnam War, the Second Indochina War was over, the relations solidified, and we had Vietnam joining COMCON and also signing a Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation with Soviet Union in 1978, kind of solidifying that relationship. And the Vietnam became a formidable ally of the Soviets in the region. So I have just a few concluding points that really align with what Dr. Pang mentioned earlier on the side of Chinese-Vietnamese relations. In the context of the Soviet Union, we see kind of a trajectory from limited interest to a regional alliance. And that can lead to a few points that we can make. Firstly, about the limits of communist internationalism that was very much influenced by national interests, also by big power politics and by personalities. And I mentioned the story of Ho Chi Minh. I mentioned Stalin's sort of prejudice and his approach that certainly played a role. And ultimately, we could see here a story of changing alliances that were a result of also changing external factors. And the relationship in this Moscow, Beijing, Hanoi triangle that was very interesting and dynamic over time. So just finally, a couple of words about sources. And these are some of the sources I also included in the shared document. There are really two historians that focused on this topic, and that's the late Ilya Gaiduk, who unfortunately passed away about 10 years ago. His book on Confronting Vietnam is certainly a source to look for. And I included a chapter by him called Developing an Alliance that is available in the shared file. And there is also a publication by Mary Olson, who covered Soviet-Vietnamese relations and the role of China from the Soviet perspective. I include one, actually her, I believe, master's thesis in the file that is widely available and can be shared. So let me end here, and happy to engage in Q&A.
Thank you, Marek. With us, we also have senior teacher Fahmi, and he'll take us through the Q&A as well as the second half of this. Fahmi, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Lloyd. Thanks again, presenters. I think I especially enjoyed the way the presentation was structured, such that we see the different timelines through the perspectives and then how things coincide. I found it very Marvel Cinematic Universe, so it's very interesting to see how the stories overlap. Right, so I think there's a lot to take in, all right, a lot to digest. Might I invite everyone to actually post questions, all right? So one option is to post questions directly on the chat, or otherwise I'll share this Padlet. Okay, if you want to see your questions emerge and you want to have some aspect of teachers voting questions up so that we have things appearing. So this is the live Q&A. The link to get to this Padlet, okay, I'll show you the QR code. Okay, if this is not very clear because it's slightly blocked, I think I will just share the link again on the chat. Okay, so that will be one option. You can also find some of the resources here, and Lloyd has also shared a Google Drive where you will see an abundance of resources, in the form of articles, the slides as well. So things you can definitely look for later down the road when we are going to start planning our lessons a bit more. So we will take a 5-minute break. Okay, so you can either take a bio break or you can take some time to process the information and then to put in your questions either in the chat or directly on the Padlet. Okay, you can also actually glance at the questions you've asked during registration, and there were there are some answers already there. So we may revisit some of the questions, but we will entertain live questions first and foremost. All right, so the time now is 4:11. Maybe we will reconvene at 4:16, and then we'll begin our live Q&A. Right, so I'll see everyone in a bit.